The wind that scoured the high plains of Wyoming territory had a personal animosity toward anything that wasn't rock or stubborn scrub. It tore at the canvas flaps of the stagecoach, seeking out the cracks to whistle its mournful, lonely tune. For Alara, huddled inside, the sound was a fitting score for the final, desolate leg of a journey that had stripped her of everything but a single, fraying thread of hope. That thread was a man named Silas Thorne, a name on a piece of paper, a promise of a life beyond the choking soot and crushing poverty of the city she'd fled. He was supposed to be a rancher. In her mind, that word had painted pictures of green pastures, a sturdy farmhouse, and a future as solid as the mountains she now saw clawing at the horizon. But when a stagecoach shuddered to a halt in what could not generously be called a town, a mere smattering of weathered buildings clinging to a dusty track called Cutter's Gap, the reality that greeted her was as harsh as the wind. Silas Thorne was not the sturdy, smiling man from her daydreams. He was lean and gaunt, his face a mask of weary angles and shadows, dominated by eyes the color of a winter sky. He said nothing, merely nodded at the driver, his gaze sliding over Alara, as if she were another sack of flour to be loaded onto his buckboard. And then she saw it. His ranch. It wasn't a ranch. It was a shack, perched on a barren rise some distance from the town. It looked less like a home and more like an oversized crate that had been dropped from a great height and left to rot. Its wood was splintered and sun-bleached, the roof patched with rusty tin. There were no fences, no barn, no livestock to speak of save for the two tired horses hitched to his wagon. A wave of cold, bitter disappointment washed over Alara, so potent it stole the air from her lungs. She had traded one form of destitution for another, more isolated one. The man, Silas, loaded her single trunk onto the buckboard with an economy of motion that spoke of long acquaintance with hard labor. He gestured for her to climb up, his silence a heavy, oppressive blanket. The ride to the shack was a study in grim finality. The wind howled, the wagon wheels groaned, and Alara's heart sank with every turn, lodging itself like a stone in her stomach. This was it. This was the end of the line. A shack on a wind-blasted hill with a man who looked as broken as his home. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The shack was worse up close. It was a jumble of mismatched lumber and tar paper, looking as if it might collapse in the next strong gust. Silas Thorne didn't seem to notice its state of disrepair, or if he did, he didn't care. He led her to the door, a flimsy thing on leather hinges, and pushed it open. He stood aside, a silent, unreadable sentinel. With a deep breath that tasted of dust and despair, Alara stepped across the threshold, into the gloom of her new life. And with 3 words, uttered in a voice as rough as burlap, his life and hers were irrevocably changed. "Storm's coming," he said. The interior of the shack was a single, large room, surprisingly clean but profoundly stark. A cast-iron stove stood cold in one corner, a neatly made cot in another. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupied the center. It was the living space of a man who took no joy in his surroundings, who merely existed within them. Silas gestured toward a second cot, pushed against the far wall. "That's yours," he said. The statement was not unkind, but it was devoid of any warmth. It was a statement of fact, nothing more. He had paid her passage. He had, in the crude calculus of the mail-order bride arrangement, purchased her presence. She was here to be his wife, to cook and clean and fill the crushing silence of this place. But as she looked at him, at the hollows under his cheekbones and the profound weariness in his eyes, she saw no hint of a husband. She saw a man who seemed to have forgotten how to be with another person. Alara placed her hands on her trunk, the only familiar object in this alien world. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice small but steady. The advertisement, it spoke of a ranch. He was lighting a lantern, the flare of the match illuminating the deep lines etched around his mouth. He didn't look at her. "The land is here." The house is not. The answer was so blunt, so final, it left no room for argument. She felt a flush of anger, hot and sharp. He had lied. A lie of omission, perhaps, but a lie all the same. He had bought her under false pretenses, luring her across a continent to this hovel. He had to have known what she would expect, what any woman would hope for. "I see," she said, the words tight. She began unlatching her trunk, her movements stiff with resentment. She would not cry. She had not cried when her father died, nor when her mother had sent her to the factory at 14. She would not give this silent, deceitful man the satisfaction. She would be as hard and unyielding as this land he called a ranch. The first days were a silent truce. Alara established a routine born of grim necessity. She cooked meals from the meager provisions he had: beans, salt pork, flour. She cleaned the single room until the floorboards shone, scrubbed a few pans until they gleamed. She mended his torn shirts, her stitches small and perfect, an act of defiance against the ugliness that surrounded her. She worked from sunup to sundown, pouring all her fear and fury into labor. Silas watched her. She felt his gaze on her back as she kneaded dough, on her hands as she tended the small fire in the stove. He never spoke unless necessary, his words clipped and functional. "Need more wood, water buckets low." He would leave before dawn each day and return at dusk, covered in dirt and sawdust, his exhaustion a palpable presence in the room. He seemed to be engaged in some monumental, solitary task out on the property, but what it was, she couldn't guess. Nor did she care to ask. Her questions had been met with a wall of stone once. She would not beat her fists against it again. The townsfolk of Cutter's Gap were no more welcoming. On her first trip into the settlement with Silas for supplies, she had felt their eyes on her. The women whispered behind their hands, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. The men stared openly, their gazes lingering. Silas seemed oblivious, or perhaps immune, to their judgment. He moved through the town like a ghost, his face a mask of indifference. Jedediah Croft, the proprietor of the general store, a man with a potbelly and eyes that missed nothing, had greeted Silas with a familiarity that bordered on insolence. "Well, Thorne, finally decided to get yourself some help. A bit prettier than the last one. I'll give her that." Alara froze, her hand hovering over a sack of beans. "The last one." Silas's reaction was swift and chilling. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head, and the winter sky, eyes fixed on Croft. The temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The flour, Jedediah," Silas said, his voice flat and deadly. "And keep your tongue behind your teeth." Croft, to his credit, paled and scurried to fetch the flour, his jovial manner vanishing like smoke. On the ride back to the shack, the silence in the buckboard was heavier than ever. Alara burned with questions, but the grim set of Silas's jaw forbade them. Who was the last one? A previous wife? Another mail-order bride he'd sent away? The mystery of Silas Thorne deepened, adding a layer of unease to her resentment. He wasn't just a liar. He was a man with a past this town knew and judged him for. The shack was perched on the edge of a vast, undulating property. It sat on a rise, and behind it, the land sloped down into a wide, shallow basin before rising again toward a line of dark, pine-covered hills. It was in that basin, shielded from the view of the main track, that Silas worked. From the shack, all Alara could see was a sprawling, chaotic heap of something covered in immense, dark tarpaulins. It looked like a shipwreck, a colossal skeleton draped in black sails, held down by a network of ropes and weighted with stones. It was an eyesore, a testament to some grand, failed project. She assumed it was the ruin of the ranch he had advertised, a barn that had collapsed, perhaps, or the foundations of a house he'd lacked the funds or the will to complete. It was the physical manifestation of his failure, and she despised it. Her life settled into a rhythm of hard work and quiet observation. She learned the landscape of his silence. There was the weary silence of the evening, the tense silence of the town trips, and a deep, brooding silence when he stood at the shack's single window, staring out at the tarpaulin-shrouded mass in the basin below. In those moments, a pain so profound emanated from him that it was almost a sound. One evening, a week after the incident in the store, she found the courage to breach the wall between them, if only with a single question. He was cleaning a wood plane at the table, his long fingers surprisingly deft. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet. He grunted in acknowledgement, not looking up. "What is that out there?" She nodded toward the window, toward the dark shape hulking in the twilight. He stopped his work. He set the plane down with deliberate care. For a long moment, he said nothing. Alara thought he would ignore her, retreat back into his fortress of silence. But then he spoke, his voice low and rough with something she couldn't name. "It's a house," he said. "A house." The word came out as a squeak of disbelief. Under all that, "It's not finished." He finally looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not just weariness in his eyes, but a flicker of raw, unguarded grief. "I was building it. For my wife." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and fragile. "My wife." So Jedediah Croft hadn't been referring to another mail-order bride. He'd been referring to the woman Silas had loved, the woman for whom he'd been building a home. She passed, Alara asked, her own voice softening. He gave a sharp, single nod, his gaze dropping back to the tool in his hands. "Fever. 2 winters ago." The work stopped, and suddenly everything shifted. The shack was no longer a symbol of his deceit, but a monument to his sorrow. The silent, gruff man was not cruel. He was broken. The lie he had told was not to trick her, but perhaps to protect himself, to keep the world at arm's length from the sight of his greatest pain. He had advertised for a wife, not because he wanted a partner to share a dream, but because he was a man drowning in solitude and had sent out a desperate, clumsy signal for another living soul to share the wreckage. The next day, the sky began to bruise. The wind, always a constant presence, picked up a new, vicious edge. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an electric tension. Silas came in from his work early, his face grim. "Tie down anything loose," he ordered. "It's going to be a bad one." They worked together, securing the flimsy door, checking the lashings on the tarpaulins that patched the roof. A strange sort of camaraderie bloomed in the shared urgency, a wordless understanding of the impending threat. By late afternoon, the world outside the shack had dissolved into a maelstrom of shrieking wind and horizontal rain. The shack groaned and shuddered around them, a tiny, fragile bastion against the fury of the storm. Alara found herself watching Silas. He moved with a calm competence, checking the stovepipe, placing a heavy log against the door. He was not afraid of the storm. He seemed almost a part of it, as elemental and untamed as the wind itself. As darkness fell, the heart of the storm arrived. The rain hammered against the roof like 1,000 fists. The wind howled like a banshee. And then the lightning began. It started with distant, flickering strobes that lit the edges of the window. Then it moved closer, the flashes becoming brilliant, stark, and immediate, followed by concussive peals of thunder that shook the very floorboards. Alara, who had always been unnerved by thunderstorms, found herself standing near the window, mesmerized by the terrifying beauty of it. Silas stood on the other side of the room, a silent silhouette against the lantern's glow. He was watching the storm too, his posture rigid. And then it happened. A bolt of lightning, impossibly bright and close, struck somewhere on the property. The world outside the window was illuminated in a single, searing blue-white flash of incandescent light. It wasn't a flicker. It was a sustained, brilliant exposure, as if a photographer's flash had frozen the entire landscape for one eternal second. In that second, the tarpaulins covering the mass in the basin became momentarily, stunningly translucent. Alara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It wasn't a ruin. It wasn't a collapsed barn or a failed foundation. For one breathtaking moment, the lightning had revealed the truth. Silhouetted beneath the dark, wet canvas was the unmistakable, magnificent skeleton of a mansion. She saw the grand, sweeping lines of a wraparound porch. She saw the tall, elegant proportions of floor-to-ceiling windows. She saw the soaring peak of a gabled roof, the intricate framework of a three-story structure, complete with a turret on one corner. It was vast, ambitious, and beautiful, even in its unfinished state. It was a palace hiding in plain sight, disguised as a disaster. The world plunged back into darkness, the thunder cracking directly overhead, so loud it felt like the sky was splitting apart. But the afterimage was burned onto Alara's retinas. The shack, the man, and the hidden mansion. She turned from the window and stared at Silas Thorne. His face was a mask in the flickering lantern light, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the deep, hollowed-out look in his eyes. He knew what she had seen. The storm had ripped away his greatest secret, laying it bare in a flash of divine, indifferent light. "You?" she whispered, the word lost in the roar of the wind. "You live in this shack, when that is out there." The anger she had suppressed for weeks came roaring back, but this time it was different. It wasn't the anger of disappointment. It was the anger of profound, staggering confusion. He didn't answer. He just stood there, a man exposed, the silence between them now charged with the impossible, revealed truth. The lie was so much bigger, so much more complex than she could ever have imagined. He hadn't just omitted the truth about a modest ranch. He had actively concealed a fortune, a dream house, a whole other reality. The question was no longer what he had done, but why. Why would a man with the means to build a palace choose to live in a pauper's hut? The storm raged on, but the true tempest was now inside the four walls of the shack. Alara across the room, her heart pounding a rhythm that matched the thunder. She stopped a few feet from him, her hands clenched at her sides. "Why?" she demanded, her voice rising to be heard over the storm. "Why lie about something like that?" Silas finally moved. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound exhaustion. "I didn't lie," he said, his voice raspy. "I told you, the house isn't finished. That is not a not-finished house, Mr. Thorne. That is a mansion you have deliberately hidden under tarps. You live in poverty by choice. You brought me here, letting me believe this was all you had. What?" Her voice cracked on the last word, a sound of pure bewilderment. He turned away from her, walking to the cold stove and bracing his hands on it, his back to her. His shoulders were slumped, the posture of a man carrying an invisible, crushing weight. "The money, the house, it's not mine." "Not really." He spoke to the stove, not to her. "It belonged to my wife, Eleonora. Her family is wealthy. Shippers from Boston. They never approved of me. A stonemason's son. But Eleonora, she didn't care about that." He paused, and Alara could hear the ragged edge of his breath. "She loved this land. She saw something in it I couldn't. She drew the plans for the house herself. So it would be our fortress, a place where their judgment couldn't reach us. The money was her inheritance. I was just the hands meant to build it." He fell silent, the story hanging unfinished in the air. Alara waited, her anger slowly being replaced by a dawning, painful understanding. "When she died," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "the money didn't matter anymore. The house, it became a monument to her. Every beam I cut, every nail I drove, it was for her. And when she was gone, the purpose was gone. It was just wood and stone. A tomb. I couldn't live in it, and I couldn't bear to look at it. So I covered up." He finally turned back to face her, and the grief in his eyes was so raw, so stark, it was like looking into an open wound. "I sent for a bride because the silence was eating me alive. I needed a voice in the house, a presence. But I couldn't have a woman come here for the money, for her money. I couldn't stand the thought of someone living in Eleonora's house who only wanted what she'd left behind. I had to know. I had to be sure." "Sure of what?" Alara whispered. "That I was desperate enough to stay in a shack. That my character was strong enough to endure this." "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty of it was disarming. "I didn't think that far ahead. I just acted. It was wrong, deceitful, but I didn't know what else to do." Alara sank into one of the chairs, the strength gone from her legs. The entire foundation of her reality here had crumbled and reformed into something new and terrifyingly complex. He wasn't a liar in the way she'd thought. He was a man so consumed by grief and fear that he had built a prison for himself next to the palace of his dead wife. He had invited her into that prison, not as a test of her character, but as a desperate, selfish, and deeply human attempt to have a companion in his misery without sullying the memory of his love. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. In the relative quiet, the sound of a single drop of water hitting the floor echoed like a gunshot. A leak. The storm had found a weakness in their small fortress. Without a word, Silas grabbed a bucket and placed it under the drip. He looked at the ceiling, then at Alara. A question hung in the air. What now? The secret was out. The pretense was shattered. Alara looked at her hands, resting on the rough wood of the table. She could demand he use some of that hidden fortune to send her back east. She could rage and rail against the injustice of his deception. Or she could see the man before her, not as a wealthy recluse or a poor rancher, but as a soul as lost and adrift as she was. He was trapped by his past, and she was trapped by her future. Perhaps, in this strange, broken place, they could find a way to untrap each other. She stood up. "The roof will need patching," she said, her voice even. "When the rain stops." Silas stared at her, his expression one of stunned disbelief. He had confessed his great, manipulative deception, and her response was practical. She was not leaving. She was not screaming. She was talking about fixing the roof. A flicker of something, gratitude, maybe, or a profound, weary relief, crossed his face. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse. "It will." In that moment, a new, fragile truce was formed. Not one of silence and resentment, but one of shared knowledge and an unspoken agreement to move forward, one patch at a time. The mansion still loomed under its dark shroud, a sleeping giant of grief and memory. But for the first time, Alara looked at it not as a symbol of a lie, but as a challenge. And she was not a woman who backed down from challenge. The weeks that followed the storm were different. The silence between them changed its nature. It was no longer an absence of words, but a space for thought, less awkward and more companionable. They patched the shack's roof together, a clumsy ballet on a rickety ladder, Silas handing her tools, Alara holding shingles in place. He discovered she was steady and unafraid of heights. She discovered his hands, though rough, were gentle and precise. One afternoon, driven by a curiosity she could no longer suppress, Alara walked down into the basin while Silas was away felling timber. She stood before the shrouded giant, the scale of it even more imposing up close. The tarps were thick and heavy, smelling of pitch and rain. She found a loose flap near the bottom and, after a moment's hesitation, lifted it. She peered into the gloom. The air inside was cool and still, thick with the scent of raw pine and sawdust. She saw the immense, soaring space of what must have been planned as a great room. A massive stone fireplace, half-finished, dominated one wall. Light filtered in through gaps in the boarded-up windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It was a cathedral of sorrow, perfectly preserved in the moment its architect had laid down his tools. On a workbench near the fireplace, she saw a collection of objects covered by cloth. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted it. Beneath were not tools, but a small collection of personal effects. A book of poetry by Keats, its cover worn, with the name Eleonora inscribed on the flyleaf in elegant script. A pressed wildflower, its color faded, and a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, a wren, so detailed she could almost feel the flutter of its wings. She touched the smooth wood of the wren, a lump forming in her throat. This was not just a house, it was a shrine. Silas wasn't just hiding a building, he was guarding a heart. She gently replaced the cloth, feeling like an intruder in a sacred space, and backed out into the sunlight, letting the tarp fall back into place. Her perspective had shifted again. She was no longer just a mail-order bride brought here by a grieving man. She was the custodian of a secret she now understood. That evening, she made a stew, taking extra care, adding the wild herbs she'd found growing near the creek. When Silas came in, he stopped and sniffed the air, a faint, surprised look on his face. "Smells good," he mumbled, a compliment so rare it felt like a declaration. As they ate, Elara spoke quietly. "The wren," she said, "is beautiful. You have a gift." Silas froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock and a flash of something that looked like betrayal. "You went inside?" It was not a question. "I did," she admitted, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm sorry if I trespassed, but I needed to understand." He put his spoon down, his jaw working silently. She expected anger, a retreat back into his fortress of silence. Instead, a look of profound sadness washed over his features. "She loved wrens," he said, his voice thick. Said they were small but had the biggest songs. Like her. It was the most he had ever volunteered about his wife. Alara's heart ached for him, for the depth of the love he had lost. "It's a beautiful house, Silas," she said, using his first name for the first time. "It's a shame for it to stay dark." He said nothing more, but he finished his stew, and the silence that followed was not empty, but full of the ghost of Eleonora, a presence they now, in a way, shared. Spring arrived, breathing life back into the muted landscape. The snow on the distant peaks began to recede, and the plains erupted in a carpet of new green and tentative wildflowers. With the changing of the season, something changed in Silas, too. The deep-etched grief in his face seemed to lessen, replaced by a kind of weary resolve. One morning, he didn't head out with his axe. He stood by the window, staring at the shrouded mansion for a long time. Then he turned to Elara. "I need a hand," he said. He led her not to the woodpile, but to the mansion. He handed her a mallet and a pry bar. "We're going to let some light in," he said. They spent the entire day working together, prying the boards from the tall windows of the great room. It was hard, dusty work, but with each board that came away, a shaft of brilliant spring sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating the vast interior. As the room filled with light, it transformed. It was no longer a tomb, but a space of immense potential, waiting to be filled with life. By the end of the day, they stood in the center of the sun-drenched room, covered in dust and sweat, and for the first time, Elara saw a genuine, unburdened smile touch Silas Thorne's lips. "It's bigger than I remembered," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. From that day on, their work shifted. The shack became their sleeping quarters, but the mansion became their life. They didn't work on finishing it, not yet. They cleaned. They swept away the dust of 2 years, washed the windows, cleared away the debris of stalled construction. Elara found that she had an eye for space and light. She'd suggest moving a workbench or point out how the afternoon sun hit a particular wall. Silas, in turn, began to talk, telling her about the original plans, about an argument he'd had with Eleonora over the placement of the kitchen, an argument he now admitted she had won. He was not just sharing the house with her, he was sharing the memories. Their tentative partnership was tested by the arrival of an unwelcome figure from the world beyond their isolated valley. A man in a city suit and a derby hat arrived in a hired buggy from a larger town down the railway line. He introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, a representative of Eleanor's family's financial interests in Boston. He was polished, condescending, and his eyes, as they swept over the shack in Alara's simple dress, were filled with open disdain. "Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone, "the family has been concerned. We understand your grief, of course, but 2 years is a long time. This project has sat fallow, a significant asset tied up in what appears to be a monument to melancholy." Silas stood stiffly, his hands clenched into fists. "It's not an asset, Sterling. It's my home." Sterling raised a skeptical eyebrow. He gestured dismissively at the shack. I was not aware you'd fallen on such hard times." Then his gaze fell on Elara, who stood in the doorway. "And I see you've acquired domestic help." The insult was deliberate and sharp. Elara felt her cheeks burn. Before she could speak, Silas stepped slightly in front of her, a subtle but clear protective gesture. "This is Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "My wife." The declaration, so bald and possessive, sent a shock through Alara. He had never called her that before. He had never claimed her so publicly. Sterling's composure slipped for a fraction of a second. A look of genuine surprise, quickly masked, crossed his face. "Your wife? My dear Thorn, have you taken leave of your senses? The family will be most displeased to hear you've entangled yourself so quickly." And with a woman of no standing, his eyes flicked to Alara again. "I trust she understands that the estate, the house, it all belongs to the memory of the first Mrs. Thorn." "Alara is my wife," Silas repeated, his voice like flint. "This is our home now. What we do with it is our business." Sterling's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "The family will not see it that way. They have instructed me to make you an offer. Sell the land, liquidate the materials, and return east. They are prepared to offer you a generous stipend to begin again. Unencumbered." The last word was aimed squarely at Alara. The threat was clear. Get rid of her or be cut off. "You can take your offer and your buggy and get off my land," Silas said, the words tight with fury. Sterling gave a cool, unpleasant smile. "I'll be back in 1 week for your final answer, Thorn. I urge you to consider your position rationally. Don't let sentimentality ruin you." He tipped his hat with mocking politeness and departed, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in his wake. That night, the air in the shack was thick with unspoken fears. The outside world, which they had managed to keep at bay, had breached their walls. Sterling's visit had laid bare the precariousness of their situation. Alara was a nobody, a mail-order bride. Silas was a grieving widower whom a powerful family considered unstable. Together, they were vulnerable. Silas finally broke the silence. He was staring into the fire, but Alara knew he wasn't seeing the flames. "He's right," he said, his voice hollow. "I have no legal standing here. The money, the land, it's all tied up in her family's name. They could take it all away. Leave us with nothing." "They could leave you with nothing," Alara corrected softly. "I came here with nothing. This shack is more than I had." He looked at her then, a deep, searching look. "When I said, you were my wife, I meant it, Alara, not just for him. He struggled for the words, his gruffness a shield for a vulnerability he was only just learning to show. "I don't want to be in this house without you. Not the shack, not the big one, either of them." It was the most honest, most profound declaration he had ever made. He wasn't talking about love, not in the poetic way Eleanor's books might have described it. He was talking about something more fundamental, more real. He was talking about partnership, about not being alone. Alara's heart, which she had guarded so fiercely, felt a painful, hopeful squeeze. "Then we won't let them take it," she said, her voice filled with a resolve that surprised them both. "It's your home because you built it with your hands. It's your land because you've bled into it. And I am your wife because I chose to stay." That is a standing that a man like Sterling will never understand. A plan began to form between them. Not a legal strategy, but a statement of intent. For the next week, they did not cower or worry. They worked, but their work had new purpose. Silas, with Alara's help, unlashed the ropes and, with tremendous effort, pulled down the massive tarpaulins from the front of the mansion. It was like unveiling a masterpiece. The sun hit the clean lines of the porch, the tall windows, the warm, raw wood of the structure. It was no longer a hidden shame, but a proud, defiant statement on the landscape. They didn't stop there. Alara, using chalk, began to mark out the lines of a garden in the soil before the porch. Silas, seeing her vision, began building her a planter box from scrap lumber. They were not just cleaning a house, they were claiming it. They were building a future in the face of the threat, brick by brick, nail by nail, seed by seed. When Sterling's buggy crested the rise a week later, he did not find a dejected widower in a dilapidated shack. He found a man and a woman on the grand porch of an unfinished mansion, sunlight glinting off the windows behind them. Alara was on her knees, her hands deep in the soil of a newly turned garden bed. Silas was hammering the last nail into a porch railing, the sound echoing cleanly in the valley air. They looked up as he approached, not with fear, but with the calm assurance of people who were exactly where they were supposed to be. Sterling pulled his horse to a halt, his jaw tight with surprise and anger. The unveiled house was a shock, a public declaration of defiance. He strode toward them, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. "Thorn, I see you've been busy." A foolish gesture. "This changes nothing." Silas set his hammer down carefully and walked to the edge of the porch, standing a few feet above the banker. Alara rose slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron, and stood beside him. They presented a united front, solid as the stone foundation beneath them. "I have my answer for you, Sterling," Silas said, his voice calm and carrying. "The answer is no. We are not selling. We are not leaving. We are building." Sterling scoffed, his face reddening. "Building what? A life on stolen money? The family will sue. They will drag your name, and hers," he sneered at Alara, "through every court from here to Boston. They will leave you with nothing but the dust on your boots." It was Alara who answered. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, imbued with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "You are mistaken, Mr. Sterling," she said, meeting his furious gaze without wavering. "You see a financial asset. We see a home. You see a woman of no standing my husband sees his wife. What you and your employers fail to understand is that some things cannot be bought, and they cannot be taken away by men like you." She gestured to the house behind them, its sun-warmed wood glowing. "This house was started in love and stalled in grief. Well, now will be finished in hope. We have a great deal of work to do, and you are wasting the daylight." It was a dismissal so complete, so profound in its simplicity, that it left Sterling momentarily speechless. He had come armed with threats of legal action and financial ruin, weapons of his world. He was utterly unprepared for the armor of their unity, for the simple, unassailable truth of their shared purpose. He looked from Silas's immovable expression to Alara's quiet, unbreakable resolve, and he saw that he had already lost. His power, the power of money and influence, had no purchase here. It slid off them like water off a duck's back. He sputtered, searching for a final, cutting remark, but found none. He was an outsider here, a man of paper and ledgers in a world of stone and soil. With a choked sound of disgust, he spun on his heel, marched back to his buggy, and rode away, defeated not by an argument, but by the quiet, powerful reality of a life they had chosen to build together. The sound of his buggy faded, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the song of a distant meadowlark. The silence that descended was not empty or tense, but peaceful, filled with the vast, quiet potential of the day. Silas turned to Alara. The sun lit the dust motes in the air around them, turning them to gold. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. Her hand, stained with the dark, rich soil of her new garden, fit perfectly. He said, "I was building a monument to melancholy," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked from her face to the grand, open door of the mansion. But he was wrong. "I was building a house for a memory. You show me how to build a home for the living." She squeezed his hand, her heart full. There were no more secrets, no more fears hiding in the shadows. There was only the sun on their faces, the solid porch beneath their feet, and the wide-open future waiting for them inside. They stood there for a long moment, two solitary souls who had found their anchor in each other, the quiet architects of a new life, ready to begin. The mansion is no longer a monument to what was lost, but a testament to what is being built. Silas and Alara worked side by side, the sounds of hammering and quiet conversation filling the valley. The tarps are gone, folded away like a painful memory, and in their place, glass is being set into the window frames, catching the western sun and filling the once dark rooms with brilliant light. Alara's garden is thriving, a patch of determined green against the wild landscape, a promise of roots taking hold. She is no longer the deceived mail-order bride, but the mistress of this rising house, her voice and vision shaping its future as much as his hands. He watches her sometimes as she hums a tune while staking her bean plants, and a slow, quiet smile touches his face. He didn't just receive a bride in the mail. He received the missing blueprint for his own heart. They have found their foundation, and it is more solid than stone. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.